Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to
Christopher Sharman, director of the China Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College, joins us on Al Jazeera Balkans to discuss China's maritime force and tensions around Taiwan. Christopher, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, to start with, can you tell us more about the China Maritime Studies Institute at the Naval War College where you teach?
Sure, Harun. First of all, thank you very much for having me today. It's truly an honor to be on your program. The comments I make today are all my own. They don't necessarily represent the positions of the United States government, the Department of Defense, or the Naval War College. But let's see what we can get into today. I think it should be a good discussion. The China Maritime Studies Institute is part of the research wing at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. What our lane in the road is China's military maritime forces. When you say military maritime, that means a lot of different things. Of course, we at the Naval War College, we're taking a look at China's Navy and what it's doing. But when you talk about the military maritime forces, you have to look at all three of China's maritime sea forces. So we take a look at the Navy, we take a look at the Coast Guard, and we take a look at the China's maritime militia. But then importantly, we also take a look at the civilian infrastructure that underpins all of that and supports China's military maritime development. But the way we do it is unique. Rather than just looking at what China's military maritime forces are doing and how they're operating, where they're going, we're looking at what China is saying about its military maritime forces. Where are the areas that they are struggling with? Where are the areas they are emphasizing? What are the things that they are trying to accomplish? So the way we have to do this, though, is we can't look at what they're saying in English because they're going to get a certain message that's out in English. But what we find is that China is talking to itself a lot of the time through journals and publications, and whether it be online or print media. And so what we do is we devour these journals and try and ascertain where they're going, what they're doing, and how they're going to get there. So our researchers in the China Maritime Studies Institute have to be, I like to say they're multilingual. Of course, they have to speak Chinese, they have to read Chinese, they have to be fluent in Chinese, but they also have to speak the language of military, which is its own language, as you know. It's sometimes there's acronyms used, there's different concepts that are explained, and you have to be able to take these concepts, these ideas that are written in Chinese, and translate them in a way that are applicable to the United States Department of Defense and to our customer base. So it's a real unique asset that the China Maritime Studies Institute brings to the greater China watching community.
But what got you interested in studying China in the first place?
That's a great question. So back in my career, I'm a civilian now, but I spent 30 years in the Navy. I know I look young, but I spent 30 years in the Navy. Early on in my career, in 1996, I was stationed aboard the United States aircraft carrier Independence. That aircraft carrier was deployed off the coast of Taiwan. The reason we were deployed off the coast of Taiwan at the time was because we saw tensions rising between China and Taiwan. There was a lot of concern that China was trying to influence the election that it was really Taiwan's first free, fair, and open election that they were about to have. And President Lee Teng-hui had made some trips to the United States to his alma mater in Cornell, and China didn't like that. So what China was doing, the PRC was doing, was amassing a very large exercise on the coast. And this exercise had all sorts of implications. Were they going to try and do something directly against Taiwan? Was this just going to be an exercise? We didn't know. So the United States aircraft carrier Independence, the ship I was on, was stationed just off the coast of Taiwan. And we had a front row seat to both the exercise and the political aftermath that followed. That is, we were able to watch China launch ballistic missiles to the north and south of Taiwan. We watched Chinese ships and submarines deploy to the Taiwan Strait, an absolutely fascinating front row seat to what China was doing. Now, in the end, the exercise appeared to have the opposite effect, and Li Tenghui won the election and
Hmm.
in Taiwan. But while I was on the ship, CNN, which was a pretty new network at the time, just a couple years old at the time, was interviewing our battle group commander, and I was fascinated by this dynamic of this China-Taiwan. What was going on? What were the geopolitics that surrounded this? So from that point, I devoted my career to focusing China. And that took me to a combination of sea tours on various U.S. Navy ships that were based out of Japan, deployed in the East China Sea, South China Sea, et cetera. But it also took me on to diplomatic assignments in Beijing, where I served as the naval attaché, and then also into Vietnam, where I was a naval attaché. And the China has been first and foremost forefront in my career focus throughout the duration of my active duty military time, but then also now here as the director of the China Maritime Studies Institute.
Right. Now, Christopher, let's move on to more China's concrete issues regarding China's military and navy. So China's President Xi Jinping has directed the PLA to become a quote-unquote world-class military by mid-century. What does this mean for China's navy?
It's a fascinating question. The China's Navy really seeks to surpass the capabilities of the United States Navy
Hmm.
in the mission areas that are aligned with PRC priorities. Now,
Hmm.
let's break that down a little bit. That doesn't mean that China's Navy seeks to be the best everywhere, all around the world. It means that it wants to be better than the United States Navy in those key areas that are consistent with PRC policy priorities. So when you break this down a little bit, there is, what is this idea of world class? It's something that Xi Jinping mentioned at the 19th Party Congress, where he said he wanted to have a world class military forces by mid-century. There's a lot of ways to measure world class. You can go back to the
Hmm.
interwar years and look where ship's tonnage and the caliber of guns was used as a measure of world class. So we don't really know what world class means specifically. However, what we do know there's a lot of different ways to measure world class. We do have some insights into what China wants to do with its world class military, with its world class Navy forces. Back a couple months after Xi Jinping called for the PLA as a whole to develop its world class military by mid century, about 2 months afterwards, China's Navy's leadership all got together and they had a very large meeting in Beijing with all the most senior Navy leaders. At this meeting, we don't know exactly what happened in this meeting, but what we have access to is some of the press reporting that came out of that meeting, where China's Navy was talking to itself a little bit about the outcomes and some of the speeches that were given at this. And what we found is we were able to identify some key characteristics of what a world-class Navy really means. And for China, what this appears to be for China's Navy is China wants to build a Navy that has global influence. The second characteristic would be the ability to exert sea control, at least in the Western Pacific. And then what underpins all of this is China's seeking to really advance its technologies, to be the first mover, to be the first one to incorporate some of the most advanced technologies that will allow China to move very fast in its development. So we have these characteristics of kind of what makes up a world-class Navy. Now, the last point I'll say on this,
Hmm.
in 2019, we saw the codification of this concept that she had talked about in World Class Navy. You saw this actually spelled out in their defense white paper, which is a public document, which is designed to tell the world, essentially promulgate some of the ideas of what's already been promulgated internally inside the PRC. In that defense white paper, it spells out China's world-class Navy ambitions
Hmm.
and world-class military ambitions. But you can see how these ideas of global influence, sea control, and technological development, how they actually support some of the missions that are identified for the PLA in that defense white paper. And so that's where I think they're going as a Navy is to really pursue the ability to execute the missions that are specified or support the missions that are specified in the Defense White Paper, and to execute these particular these adhere to these characteristics, achieve these characteristics that were spelled out soon after the 19th Party Congress.
Right.
I should say the final point on this is that 2049 or mid-century, that seems like a long way away, and frankly, a lot can happen in 25 years. We have reporting in the last couple of years that China is actually speeding up its goal. We don't know. We saw out of the 20th Party Congress in 2022, we saw them actually say that we need to move faster on this goal. So this actually could be a near-term goal as opposed to something that is designed for mid-century.
Now, I believe in line with this, we have seen China churning out new ships on a pace much faster than the rest of the world. I'm sure we'll have time to speak on that more afterwards. But I wanted to ask you, we have seen the PRC conduct quite a number of, military exercises around Taiwan recently, at times often testing the response times of the Taiwanese air defense systems. What are some of your observations of what China is doing in these exercises?
It's a great observation. These exercises have been absolutely fascinating to watch. It's been interesting to watch both the capabilities that China, its Navy, and its military maritime forces have been advancing, and some of the tactics that they have been using. I think it's important here. When we talk about these exercises, we kind of become numb to, hey, it's another Chinese exercise. And I think it's important to kind of put these exercises into greater context. And so let's just briefly talk about these exercises. In August of 2022, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi went and visited Taiwan. And that elicited a PRC military response soon after her departure. Now, this was a robust military response. There were closure areas, exercise areas around Taiwan. On the Navy side, there were 14 warships that deployed off the coast of Taiwan at various locations, and at least one submarine by some of the open source reporting that were there. There were missiles that were fired both around Taiwan and over Taiwan. This is, by all practical purposes, a very large, a very impressive exercise. In some circles, this was called the Fourth Taiwan Strait Crisis. Whether or not you want to lump it up with some of the nuclear potential crises that happened back in the 1950s is debatable, but it certainly had everyone's attention. But since that time, China's exercises have become more common, more frequent, and frankly, from a Navy perspective, have integrated more capabilities. So let's fast forward through these exercises just briefly. In that following spring, in March of 2023, the president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen at the time, transited the United States, and she met with Speaker of the House McCarthy in California. That then elicited another exercise, and in that exercise, we started to see the integration of China's Coast Guard. China's Coast Guard was operating the strait. No one really paid a lot of attention to it because it wasn't doing anything particularly strange. But we saw an increase in the number of ships. We saw an increase in the number of aircraft sorties flying over the Taiwan Strait and the Taiwan centerline. Now, since that time, we've seen two additional exercises. When the current president of Taiwan, William Lai, was inaugurated back in May, they conducted what was called the Joint Sword exercise. And then this exercise increased, again, the number of ships, the number of sorties, the pressure on Taiwan. And in this case, China's Coast Guard was operating to the east of Taiwan. And then most recently, a couple months ago, maybe in October, the 1010 speech that William Lai gave, a speech which is a speech that is given every year by the president of Taiwan, that is given on their national day in October 10th. That elicited another exercise. And in this case, we saw record numbers of China Navy ships, 17 ships, in fact, that were operating around Taiwan, and 17 Coast Guard ships that were circling Taiwan and operating around Taiwan's offshore islands. So what we see in in these exercises is we've seen essentially an evolution of law enforcement integration into the exercises. We've seen this normalization of large-scale exercises that are really in response to non-military, what China would say are provocative actions. We've also seen a ramp up of ships and aircraft in just terms of numbers, and the essentially an overall increase of coercion. What some authors are calling this kind of an anaconda strategy, essentially a big snake that's starting to get tighter and tighter, and or a noose that's wrapping around Taiwan's neck. So it's this integration of forces that I think is perhaps the most interesting to watch. It doesn't mean there's direct coordination, but there's certainly more military maritime forces that are participating or that appear to be part of these exercises. I think that's perhaps the most interesting point of these.
Now, you know, in recent years, you have written quite a bit on China's efforts to develop a blue water navy. Could you elaborate on the strategic objectives behind China's naval expansion?
Sure. China's building of its blue water navy really comes as a response to strategic guidance to build a navy that's commensurate with what China's strategic priorities are. Chinese Navy authors, in fact, would say that, and this is a direct quote from them. I think it goes something like this: that wherever our ships sail, and in terms of the commercial ships, China's Navy warships should go. And wherever their overseas interests expand, China's Navy should be there. So that speaks to worldwide interests of China. You know, just based on fact, 90% of China's trade by volume goes by sea, and there are millions of Chinese citizens that are working in countries around the world, in just about every country around the world, in fact. So it's important to take a look at kind of their overall expanding interests. Now, let's talk about some of this modernization that's gone on in building this blue water navy. Let's put China's Navy into context. China's Navy has approximately, and it's changing almost daily here, approximately 370 ships. That's and 170 of those are capital warships, blue water ships, as you might say. And China's overall Navy is expected to grow to about 395 ships in the next year or two, and about 435 ships by 2030. So it is growing very, very, very fast. And so when we look at China's expansion into the far seas and China's strategy writ large, I think it's important to take a look at the evolution of the strategy and why they're going into the far seas now, and perhaps why they have expanded in the way they have, and frankly, they're telling us why they're doing this. And all we have to do is take a look at the evolution of their maritime strategy. If you think back to the 1980s, China's focus, frankly, wasn't in the Pacific Ocean. China was looking north. It was looking at the Soviet Union. It didn't need a robust navy to address with what they saw at the time was perhaps their most significant threat. Through the 1980s, China debated internally about what its strategy should be, and that by 1993, China's strategy and what it calls its strategic direction switched from looking at the Soviet Union to looking down towards the southeast coast and looking at Taiwan as perhaps the area where it needed to focus the PLA, the Chinese military forces, its energy. So we saw the Navy at that point adopt a strategy called near seas defense. And when I say near seas are those seas that are within the first island chain. That's the Bohai Gulf, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Yellow Sea. Those that all within that area that is, you know, to the west of Japan and Taiwan, etc. And that was the area of China's focus. But in 2004, Hu Jintao, who was the president of China at the time, gave the Navy, gave the military as a whole, what were called new historic missions. And those new historic missions, one of those missions was to protect China's expanding global interests. For the Navy, that has major repercussions. The Navy then recognized it needed to be able to go out and go further abroad than just these near seas. This near seas weren't enough for the Navy. So we saw this gradual evolution of the Navy to looking at in 2004, from 2004 to 2014, we started to see deployments that went out into the Philippine Sea, and their strategy was clearly changing. So in 2015, they adopted a new strategy, and that was near seas defense and far seas protection. That far seas protection is operations outside that first island chain, and we've seen that. You've seen that. We've all seen the more regular exercises they're doing out in the Philippine Sea.
Yeah.
Now, what's most interesting, Haroon, and just closing on this point, is I think we're seeing an evolution of that strategy happen once again. We're starting to see some language in Chinese journals that suggests their strategy may be evolving from just near seas defense and far seas protection, but incorporating two new elements. That's near seas defense, far seas protection, what they call oceanic presence, and expansion to the two poles. And that speaks again to where Chinese national interests are and where China is now operating more frequently, where China's Navy is operating more frequently. We've seen off by the Aleutian Islands. We've seen them operating up towards the Arctic. And its partnership, of course, with Russia is very interesting to watch. But you see this expanding strategy writ large. So it's an evolution of strategy that China is doing, and its Navy is following suit.
Right. Now, I believe in line with this, China has been developing its aircraft carrier program. There are, I believe, 3 operational aircraft carriers. China is working on the 4th and 5th. How important is the development of this indigenous aircraft carrier program to the PLNA's overall viability as a global sea power? And what are some of the barriers that remain for China's shipbuilding industry, in pursuing a fleet of domestically designed aircraft carriers? I think they've had some certain issues with their catapult system. They've been trying to copy the American one. It wasn't too successful. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I think when you look at the carrier program, it's looking at that evolution of the carrier program and how quickly they've been able to make jumps, technological jumps in that carrier program that perhaps is the most interesting. You see their first carrier, the Liaoning CV-16, which essentially a Hulk purchased from Ukraine. I think essentially brought in initially as a floating casino that was revamped and changed around and turned into their first experimental aircraft carrier. And that's an aircraft carrier they're operating right now, and we see that conducting regular operations for the Chinese Navy. But then their first indigenously constructed aircraft carrier was the Shandong CV-17, and we have seen CV-16 and CV-17 conducted most recently joint operations and together, which is very complicated operations. 2 carriers conducting flight operations, integrated battle group operations all at the same time. Very, very impressive capabilities that they're able to do. The next carrier, the Fujian, is undergoing sea trials right now, and you're right, Haroon. This is this evolutionary step where the first 2 carriers were ski jump ramped carriers, essentially carriers that didn't use the catapult system in a way that the Western U.S. carriers would use them. This third carrier is using essentially electromagnetic ways of launching their aircraft, and that's now coming online. So but that technology is in line with the United States' most advanced aircraft carriers, this electromagnetic launch capability. So very impressive that they made such massive strides so quickly. And then you're right, probably a couple more carriers are to follow. I think like you mentioned, construction of a 4th is maybe underway, and we may see a 5th or a 6th. I think the most interesting thing to watch in the carriers, though, is how they use them. There are certainly peacetime applications for the aircraft carrier. I mean, what does the aircraft carrier give China? The aircraft carrier in peacetime is certainly a symbol of world-class capabilities. It certainly sends both a regional and a global message of how capable China's Navy is. But then, you really have to look at how are they going to use this in wartime? Taiwan itself, which is the focus of China's efforts, is already within land-based air range of the PRC. They don't need to project power with that carrier to use that carrier necessarily against Taiwan. However, we are seeing that carrier integrated into operations when they're doing some of these massive military exercises around Taiwan. We're seeing them put that carrier to the east of Taiwan. So they may be looking at ways to pressure Taiwan from the east to use that carrier. But I think what's most interesting to the carrier is where they're going to use it in the future.
Right.
And that's where I think our attention should be is they're certainly going to be operating in and around China, but watch for these carriers to start to deploy out to the far seas, not only to the Philippine Sea, which we've already seen. We have not seen it yet go to the Indian Ocean. Perhaps we could see it go as far as China's Navy port in Djibouti over in Africa. And that speaks to the growing presence and the growing capability of China's Navy and where it's going to take its carrier program. So distinguishing between peacetime and wartime, I think those are two important ways of taking a look at their aircraft carrier program.
So I want to ask you something really important. That's how China utilizes, maritime militias, even fishing vessels, in projecting its power and exerting control in the South China Sea. We have seen numerous cases of Chinese fishing vessels ramming into, the Philippine Coast Guard over the past couple of years. How closely is this under the control of the people's of China's Navy, and to what extent are their activities under the control of the Communist Party in Beijing?
Yeah, it's a great question. The maritime militia has certainly got a lot of attention since 2016 when China finished construction of its artificial islands down in the South China Sea. And on a daily basis, we're seeing maybe 300 maritime militia vessels that are operating around the South China Sea at any given time. In terms of coordination, there is no question that some of these operations are coordinated with the Navy. China, the way it's using the maritime militia is it is the first layer of defense or offense that will be used. Imagine three concentric circles where the maritime militia is up front, China's Coast Guard is backing them up, and then China's Navy is backing up the Coast Guard. So you have these concentric rings essentially around any particular target. So in some cases, you're seeing maritime militia that are the units that are harassing or bumping, like the Filipino vessels that have been conducting resupply missions out to Second Thomas Shoal. Or in some cases, you're seeing the Coast Guard conduct these. Now, there's no question to do these kinds of operations, there has to be some coordination. All three of these sea services ultimately report to the Central Military Commission. Where they are coordinated, where that level of coordination actually happens, I don't know if we know exactly where it's happening and how it's happening, but has to be some tactical level coordination, and there certainly is some strategic level coordination that's going on.
Right, Christopher Sharman, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time and for your insights.
Oh, Harun, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?